I just want to start out by saying I loved your book so much, Tracy. It was really unexpected. It was not what I thought it would be going in to a story that I thought, okay, it's a noirish story about a woman in search of her birth mother, and then it was about every single other thing. So I'm really, really excited to talk to you about it, and thank you for coming and joining me here. But I thought also, one of the great pleasures of this book is just the writing, and I wondered if you would be willing to read just an excerpt.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Catherine, and thank you to the library and AAPI, New Jersey, for having me. So I'm going to read just from the very beginning of the book, and hopefully this won't be too long. A few years back, despite a lifelong renunciation of the urge, I surrendered to obsession with a woman. So I was beside myself, I was myself. It was no time to basket case through life. I did. I wanted her, wanted everything, and all of her was missing. Circa that revelatory, sad sack time, I left S, the man everyone thought I'd get around to marrying. I skipped out on my beloved Brooklyn for a job in Poughkeepsie, the lesson of which was that gas station stench had reach. I did not see friends. I saw a peaked white wedding tent on the campus lawn where I taught writing classes. Then, once COVID-19 spiked, I saw for nearly every waking hour the one-bedroom apartment of drop ceiling tiles where I taught over Zoom. Time itself felt dark with something more than night, as Ray Chandler might have written, or maybe I just over-identified with the theorist Lauren Berlant's sentence, "The crisis is of what to do when one's long habit of doing the work of being oneself no longer works." In fact, myself was no longer recognizable. Where I was a dunce, where else I contained multitudes, was, in other words, both a dunce and someone unrecognizable to herself. But suppose I had an interest in getting my story straight. I could level with myself. On paper, I was 33, adopted, Korean-born, New England-bred, profession writer, and because no one made a living writing anymore, profession professor. My net worth was roughly dog. I had not evaded taxes, but I had evaded children. There were consolations in my back pocket, most notably that prior to this period in 2020, during which much of what I did resembled impotent riot, I had been many selves besides a person who wanted this missing woman. I had been a wannabe Olympian and a minor child actor. I had been a zealot for friendship, hedonist for ideas, and bartender to men baroque in their disappointments, who, ordering Tecate, would say dumb things like, "Take me to Tijuana, baby." I had been a kid in a household where bras were referred to as over-the-shoulder boulder holders, and the doctoral candidate whose dissertation was originally to postulate an emergent 19th century chronotope. I had been associated with a man, alias S, for 10 years, to whom I would not apologize for remaining at my writing desk for days and then staying out all night. I had written a couple of books. I had been someone who detained herself theorizing about the meaning of this missing woman to her own life before making any sudden moves, which meant I had also become someone who agonized over tardy recognitions, forgot to eat and paste. Therefore, my own raving mind thought, in conclusion, why should I not also be a person who found a woman named Jo Ki-young?
Thank you so much. You teach creative writing, and when I started reading this book, I thought about how in the classes that I took, and maybe also in the classes that I taught, we talked a lot about endings, but we didn't talk as much about beginnings. But I love your opening because it sets up sort of the scope of the book. And it's so surprising. We have all these quotes, these theorists, we have the problem at hand, which is this missing woman. We begin with this rupture, which is the rupture of the pandemic, which is kind of a rupture in time. And then there's the rupture of your relationship with S, and then this sort of first rupture with this missing woman who was your birth mother. And so I guess I started thinking about just sort of like the framing of the story. And I was curious if you could talk to us about how you went about setting up the frame of this book.
Yeah, I think that was one of the biggest challenges as a writer. You know, in so many ways, we often talk about narratives hinging on desire and what characters want. And I think that one of the things that was really difficult for me in this book was to be able to succinctly pin down what exactly it was that this character, who happens to be me, was after in looking for this person. There are very few figures that I think that we could have more reasons for finding than a mother. In some ways it's so common sense, and yet, of course, it never is. And so, you know, I was thinking a lot about trying to establish the desire to find this person. It also is very important to me that it be clear to the reader that it's not as though Tracy, the character, is just wandering around her entire life by herself or something, right? Like, it is a sort of unusual moment in her life in some way that she has found herself, like, in this disgusting apartment in Poughkeepsie by herself during the pandemic. And, you know, there's a lot of tonal work that I wanted to do because I think yeah.
And there's this, I mean, even as you were reading, I was thinking about like all of the sort of like epistemological doubt that you infuse the opening with, that sort of is present throughout the book. Like, what is a mother? What is the definition of a mother or a daughter or motherhood itself? And I'm curious, I guess, just listening to you talk, if you can talk a little bit, I guess, also about the sorts of things that you were trying to interrogate or found yourself interrogating and the form that you took. I mean, I thought it was really fun or interesting that you sort of dive into it as if it's a mystery, right? Or because it is a mystery, or as if in this like tone that's like very much the tone of like a detective novel. But I don't even know if there's a question in there, but I think you will understand what I was trying to say. But I guess maybe what I was trying to say is I found it interesting that you took this sort of like interrogative posture in the book and you interrogate everything, which I loved.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think in so many ways we often think of memoir being about sort of a quest for self-realization, and I think what this book is really interested in is how do we become a self in relation to others, and specifically like the people that we either call family or who we reject as family, or who we're trying to figure out if they are family at all. And so, you know, the book, like I am somebody who is always questioning. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's like it's a feature, not a bug, but it feels like a bug, you know. Do you know what I mean by that? Yeah. And so I think that the book is, you know, at that particular moment in my life, I think I was very much trying to figure out, well, like, where could my life go at this point? Not only because, yes, it's the beginning of the pandemic, and we had no idea at that point, as I'm sure many people here remember, like, what was going to happen. Like, there were many times where we thought, like, maybe we're just going to sort of die. Well, yeah, die, or if we don't, like, maybe, you know, just, like, maybe be stuck inside like this for the next, like, 8 or 10 years or something. Like, there was no sense that there was like a story in our life left in some way, right? It
or
felt,
time.
Or time. Yeah, like that entire year was so strange. But so I think that was a period where I was very much trying to figure out, like, well, if we ever get out of here, and like, you know, what am I going to do with myself? Like, what would it mean for me to live a good life? Because certainly I think everybody felt like they weren't living a very good life at the time, or maybe with some exceptions. But I think most people felt that they were living the worst version of their lives. And so one of the questions is also about, like, well, what would it mean to live a good life? And certainly I think one of the things that the pandemic pushed us to consider is that that would involve connection, right, with other people. And this person who was missing my entire life, I think, one of the reasons that the book does have the questioning tone is because how are you supposed to explain to somebody, even to yourself, why it matters if somebody is missing if you don't remember them in the first place, right? Like, how can you sort of understand that as any type of loss, as opposed to simply like the difference between that and just never having met all of the strangers that you've never met in your entire life. And so, yeah, there's a bit of a sort of paradox there that I think has been something that has just kind of like been a scratch at the back of myself for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciated the way that you sort of dove into that. I don't know if ambiguity isn't the right word, but I'm just going to use it because it's all I've got. But as I was reading, I was also struck by, as an adopted child, there's a way in which your relationship to the idea of motherhood is anomalous. It's not the sort of standard definition. And I guess I had two thoughts about that. One was it made me really think. Part of this book is your trip to Korea and searching for this mother who's in Korea, but it made me think about the challenges of writing a narrative in which, like, the character is a little bit of an anomaly, and so like the extra sort of like explanation that needs to go in, or the extra sort of like in order to communicate to an audience, the kind of extra explaining that has to go into the situation because it's not sort of just like what everybody agrees upon. And so I wondered the degree to which that had to do with your constantly sort of like defining things, and then contradicting the definitions that you've just given, which I actually really loved. I thought it got at sort of the complexity of the situation. But I also wondered if you could talk a little bit about like your different conceptions of motherhood that you sort of dive into. And I also want to note that in the beginning of the book you tell us that, you say you evaded children, but it comes up a couple times, this like your own grappling with the possibility of becoming a mother, and I was really interested in the way that those things work together.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you mentioned earlier, the book at many points makes reference to like other people's definitions, and so like one of the things that I do in the book is I invoke different people's conceptions of motherhood, and some of them are a little bit off base in a way, or sideways. Like one of the epigraphs comes from a Saidiya Hartman book, and the sentence is, "Young women not in desperate need, not saddled with children and old enough to say hell no and get out of my face, evaded capture." And what she was actually talking about, in that particular life, in that particular sentence, are like the subjects of that particular book, who are people who are, Black people in America, living in the time after slavery has ended, but who have like largely, whose lives have largely gone unexamined, and she was particularly interested in young women in these communities. And so when she talked about them evading capture, I think part of what she was talking about is that they literally evaded being captured to, by photographs that were taken by social workers. And so when you go into the historical archives, they might not be there because, in fact, they were living these lives that maybe didn't include something like motherhood, which might have drawn attention and state intervention. And then I also have the Adrienne Rich quote at the beginning, which is sort of about women and mothers. And the last part is, what woman has not dreamed of going over the edge of simply letting go? And so, I realize this is a long way that I'm taking to answer your question, but, I think in my particular case, I grew up with the notion that motherhood is very much something that you get to walk away from, or that you get to reject, right? And that it's, I think I probably was raised sort of thinking about, that some people opt into it and some people don't. So in the case of, my parents who adopted me, right, these are people who opted, very, very specifically and intentionally opted into parenthood. And my biological mother, well, as I came to understand eventually, also, I suppose, did at some point opt into biological parenthood, but also at a certain point very much opted out of it. And so, I think the book also, very specifically is about a time in my life when I was thinking a great deal about whether or not I, wanted to be a mother, because of the age that I was at that point, because I was at the end of this relationship, and probably also because I was alone and baby talking my dog for many hours a day during the pandemic. But yeah, I mean, I think in the book it's probably pretty clear that in many ways the ways that I think of being a mother has to do with the sort of dailiness of motherhood, and the way in which care is enacted over time in a sustained way. Whereas, my biological mother, I mean, it comes out in the book and it came out in life, in fact, was that type of mother to her other children, right? But, wasn't specifically, with me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that struck me when I was reading the book was this kind of, before you met your biological mother, this link that you felt, that she got away with something, that she had to walk away from motherhood in the way that you were considering or doing yourself. Yeah. And I guess we'll get to it later, but I do have just this curiosity about sort of the ideas that you had before you went to Korea, and then sort of what the reality of that situation was when you got there. That I don't want to jump too far ahead in the plot, so maybe we should get to Joe Adams.
Oh yeah.
And he's such a good character, and I wondered if you wanted to just tell us who he is and how he sort of propels the search forward.
Yeah. So very early on, when I was looking for this woman, Jo Ki-yeon, who was the woman who gave birth to me, I thought. I tried to hire a private detective to help me find her because, again, it was the pandemic, so many agencies and institutions that might have helped otherwise were really not running normally. So I think, there, even in the best of circumstances, there's enormous waits for these for this type of work. But now everything was basically at an absolute standstill. So I tried to hire a private investigator, and as it turns out, if you look on the internet, and there are many, and so I had called a number of them, and the one that I ended up sort of settling on in my mind, right, was Joe Adams, who was living in St. Louis, Missouri at the time, had been a CIA operative. I had sort of come to him because he had done a great deal of international work as a PI, and he had said that he had done some work in Korea. And so eventually, we sort of got to talking, and we had many conversations, or not many, but we had these really robust conversations about the search, and in so many ways, he was like my biggest cheerleader in trying to find this woman.
One of the things that I loved most about this Joe Adams character is he totally feels like he came out of a movie. And I thought there's so many characters in your book that talk about how this sounds, Philip, who feels like it's something out of a movie, and I felt like there was this constant sort of like interesting tension between sort of like the reality of your search and sort of like the mythology or like the storytelling around your search.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you that probably a lot of it, didn't feel like a movie. Like, for instance, like a lot of the, just looking on the internet and things like that, right? And of course, those are the moments that maybe people don't see as much, like the waiting and the almost like studious pursuit of this person. But there certainly was a tension, and really, at a certain point, I didn't really think that I was going to find this person. I'd all but sort of decided in my mind that I needed to sort of accept that it was game over, and sort of around the time that I really started trying to make myself believe that is, in fact, then when I was able to find her. So. But it was, I think that there were many strange circumstances in the search, but in some ways, some that were so outside of what I would have anticipated. Like Joe Adams, of course, is this character who, I think, he feels like a PI, he is a PI, and I'm sure he's also a somewhat self-aware PI. There's a way in which I think he likes in his life performing that role, in a lot of ways. But maybe because I didn't grow up in Korea, or maybe for other reasons, so much of what ended up sort of transpiring later almost in some ways felt as though it evaded my sense of how stories work.
So then, and I actually want to follow up on that, how you ended up structuring a book around, a reality that feels like it evades your sense of how stories work. But so you go to Korea, and there's a question that you keep asking your students in this book, which is what does the speculative imagination offer that reality doesn't? And so up until now, what you know of your mother has been largely speculative. Some of it is information that you have in documents that may or may not be correct. And then you sort of have to confront the reality of her. And I wondered if you could talk about that experience, but also with this question of what is the speculative imagination and what is reality and what is sort of the relationship or the confrontation between them. I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, I think that probably many people have had this experience, will sort of recognize the way in which, when you speculate about somebody you've never met, of course, it's they can be anyone, right? And there's so much weight that sort of carries into the eventual meeting. But you also don't have anything really to run with, right? So it's not as though, I had some information, but most people, don't have a lot of information. So what you can imagine is somewhat limited, right? And of course, in this case, I didn't speak Korean.
You had 6 phrases, right?
Yeah. And so, in terms of what I anticipated before I went, there were a few things that I knew. I found out from paperwork that that my mother and father had been having an affair, that she was divorced, that she ran a cafe. Now, some of these things ended up not being true. The affair was true, right? And so, but going into it, it's sort of like what I imagined about her in some ways was that she was somebody who didn't feel the need to sort of like follow the script, as it were, you know. And so one of the things, that was one of the reasons I was interested in her. I know that many people, like when I talk to them about this, like have very different feelings, right? Like they like are hoping that it's going to be like, I don't know, some like Leave It to Beaver or something like that, right? But I was actually really interested in the idea that this person was not that, right? In my mind, I think I had like imagined this story in which she was somebody who had like decided she didn't want to be a mother and just like went about her life, you know, as a person who just happened to not have a child, like doing all of these things that she had wanted to do and would have felt too encumbered by a child to do. You know, and of course, that wasn't really the case exactly because, you know, I ended up finding out that, you know, she had 3 other children. So, so she was very much still somebody who, you know, had that to consider, although she didn't always, because she's, you know, I think that, I'm sure there were many sacrifices that she made for motherhood, but there are also many ways in which she maybe did do what she wanted, but maybe partially because she wasn't really like thinking about anyone else. Like I think she's a very strange person and sort of like lacks self-consciousness in a certain way. Yeah.
Another thing that I found really interesting when I was reading your book is, you know, you go in, you know a few phrases that you've learned like on the airplane ride over to Korea, and you have to sort of like confront this incredibly sort of like different culture without sort of like your superpower of this incredibly hyper-articulate language that you have in your mind at all times. You have to communicate with these people with like a very blunt instrument of 6 phrases. And I guess I was curious about, like, you're somebody who thinks about language a lot, and I was curious about like how it felt to experience like communicating with other people without language, but also if you felt like it changed your relationship to language, or if it changed the way that you think about language while you were there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there was a little bit of magical thinking involved. Like I think that in some way I probably thought that I was going to understand more than I did.
Yeah.
And you know, so many of the conversations that I ended up having when I was there were like through a translation app.
And they were tragic.
They were
It was like the translation app was tragic. Yeah.
Yes. And so it's like the most clear conversations a lot of times were like tended to be like when I wanted like coffee.
Yeah.
Which I often do. You know, because I had learned that word, so I could say, yeah. So you know, certainly there was something that they did learn about me, you know, which was that. But yeah, I mean, I have dedicated my life in so many ways to thinking about and studying and putting together language, and you know, I went and I really didn't have that at my disposal. And I think that in many moments it felt like ridiculous to me. Like there was this very terrible irony that I had partially probably inflicted on myself, in that I had spent, as I said, spent a great deal of my life thinking and studying language, but not the language that I could actually engage with this person in, or with any of the family that I met there. But I also had a very strong sense throughout the many conversations that I had when I was in Korea that in some capacity it sort of didn't matter. Because even across language, it was very clear to me that many people were lying at various points, and so it sort of didn't matter. And in a way, the crudeness of the language almost made, like through the apps, almost made it more apparent, I think, because it wasn't as though people could sort of hide behind the subtleties of language. It's like they were trying to say things to me, but as though I was a very unintelligent 3-year-old, which in Korean, I guess I am. And so, you know, in using these sort of cruder forms of language, I think ended up giving themselves away a little bit more often.
Yeah, there were so many sort of like misunderstandings when you first get to Korea and you are being held by the customs guy, and you think that you need to bribe him. I actually like died laughing from like discomfort and the ridiculousness of it. But then there were all these moments, and I was curious if in transcribing the conversations that you had with your family members, you understood some of them differently, or if there's this moment when you're talking to your mother and she says the taste of hand, and it was strange for me as somebody who speaks Korean, because I thought, oh, she's talking about 손맛, which is it's like translated to just like your hands can taste the food that you're making, and so I thought, oh, there are all these things that are trying to be communicated, and they're just. It's just getting totally missed. And then here comes Tracy, and I sort of love this, that they're trying to lie to you, and it's very clear, and they're embarrassed, right, about this story of how you were born and how you came to be adopted. And Tracy's saying things like, "So are you saying my mother liked sex?" And it's just this this thing that happens between you. Or between this character of Tracy and her family, that I thought I actually just really admired this sort of like brute force approach of actually I'm going to make you answer these questions. But I guess I just did wonder, like when you were writing these scenes, what was the experience of writing them? Was it just like a recapitulation, or did you feel like you had a different sort of understanding of what had happened than when you were living it?
I mean, I think that there were a number of moments that I didn't necessarily get farther in my understanding.
Maybe my question is like a broader question, like maybe that was too specific. Maybe what I'm really just asking is like, what is it like to write a memoir?
Oh, okay.
As opposed to fiction, even maybe I could rephrase it in this way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, in some ways, like, working through this book, I mean, largely I ended up knowing, I think, the shape that I wanted it to take, but there were certain parts of the book that I didn't, you know, or, like, things had happened that maybe I didn't include in the final draft. But also I think one of the things that was, well, probably the most difficult part of writing this book was writing the ending, because I just kept being alive, and so did she, and you know, in some ways, like, things were not resolved. There, like, nothing was in a bow. Like, certainly there was a conclusiveness to the fact that, like, at some point I left Korea. But that it didn't feel possible that the end of the book could just be, well, you know, now she went, she met the person, and now she left, right? It felt as though I still needed at least kind of one more chapter to think about, well, you know, what does it mean that you have done this, right? Like, what does it mean that you've gone to go look for this person and found her and, like, had this sort of confrontation at a moment in which maybe there's, like, some sort of desire to have a confrontation with, like, what's real in a certain capacity. And so, yeah, I think that one of the things that's really strange about it is that, and I keep saying this to people, like, you know, it's not healthy to think about yourself this much, right? So when you're writing, you know, like, I'm an incredibly slow writer, and so I was at a certain point, because the book was due, I was, like, writing it every day, all day, for, like, months, and
did you start writing this book, like, after all, not after all of things, but after you had gone to Korea and come back, or were there parts of the book that were written beforehand? Or?
Some I had written before I went to Korea. So the beginning of the book I wrote before I went to Korea. I mean, it was very different then in, like, the form that it was in. But, you know, I was, like, starting to think about, well, what does it mean that this person, like, that I want to find this person now, right? And then, but most of the book was written after I went to Korea. You know, I didn't get very far. It's like maybe I had, like, 2 chapters of the book before I went to Korea, and then most of it was written after. And really, probably half of the book was written in sort of maybe like a 4-month span. That was like where I was working really intensely, and as I said, thinking about myself far too much. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is that's difficult about memoir is that nobody wants to think about themselves that, well, most people don't want to think about themselves that much, right? Like, you do actually want to go out and, like, one of the great pleasures of writing other types of books is that you get to go explore other people's worlds.
And so how did you end up, I guess, structuring or choosing the structure of this book that's the story of a thing that happened?
Yeah, I mean, from very early on, I was interested in sort of the notion of the investigation, because, well, first of all, I mean, I didn't know if I was going to find this person. And you can imagine, I mean, I don't know if there are any journalists here, but I've also written journalism, and it's like there's a way in which you can write a narrative where you've gone and you've done the work, you've done the research, and you're telling the story of what happened before. Like, I did not have to tell the story of the searching, right? I could have, for instance, found her, and then the entire book could have been, I don't know, the story of my mother, and like from like 1980 to like 1986, or, you know, something like that. But I think I was really interested in this notion of investigation because, maybe specifically because in some ways I was defining what I was looking for and what the desire was to be so squirrely. And also because I was thinking about the way in which, like, at the risk of being quite Freudian, right, searching for your mother, right, is also always kind of searching for your missing self, the person you've not yet become. And so, so I sort of followed that, but there's moments that in the book where I do some weird stuff, because, you know, I'm me, and I have to, and because there were moments that sort of like overspilled the shape of a procedural plot, I would say. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about those moments that sort of overspilled?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's like there's one chapter, or like fairly early on, that's not exactly a flashback chapter, but it's sort of like about the family that raised me, and it's a shorter chapter, and it collapses a lot of time within it, and then it sort of almost offers like an interpretation of itself at the end of it. There's another chapter that sort of at some point moves into the second person for a while and then pulls back out of it and is sort of talking about like writing that chapter. And the final chapter is like is like an unwieldy chapter, like an intentionally unwieldy chapter. And in some ways I think does feel like a swerve from the rest of the book. And I was certainly thinking about like a volta at the end of the book. But yeah.
In those moments when you're sort of spilling over or swerving, do you feel like you're getting away with something a little bit as a writer?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's the hope. I mean, I'm sure that there will be people who feel like I didn't get away with it, but you know.
Oh, you get away with it.
Thank you.
I have some other questions for Tracy, but I actually wanted to open it up to the audience in case.
How difficult is it for you with the students today, the way the current climate is in terms of, you know, language is so much slang and imprecision and exaggeration, and you can't separate fact from fiction so much, you know. How difficult is it for you to get your points across in teaching?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you. I mean, I think that, you know, the truth of the matter is most of my students are writing fiction or poetry. So, you know, that this sort of information literacy aspect is a little bit less something that I have to worry about. If I do end up teaching a creative nonfiction class or a journalism class, though, I will get back to you on that.
Anybody else?
First of all, thank you so much. I love hearing about your journey. I'm also curious about your writing process and everything. You went through a stage when you went searching for your mother and stuff where language wasn't your language, when suddenly communication wasn't words in the way that you've used words. Has that influenced you now? Do you think back on that? Do you feel differently about how you use language and how you talk about journalism or writing or creative writing or anything because you had to go through that without the use of your, for lack of a better word, native language?
Yeah, I mean, well, I certainly think that in some ways it's an encounter that sort of names the contours of the limitations of language. But you know, I think one thing that was interesting when I was writing the book is the way in which I recognized that my own style as a writer was being sort of gently nudged in a slightly different direction by the experience itself. And what I mean by that is that I am sure had the circumstances been different, that I would have been very tuned into reporting back the language that was used exactly, and thinking primarily about that. But, you know, one of the things that I found myself doing maybe much more than I do in my day-to-day life was sort of tuning into people's physicality when I was in Korea because I didn't know what they were saying. And so consequently, then in the writing, maybe a little bit more than I would have been inclined to otherwise, ended up maybe like noticing certain details or mentioning certain details about their physicality.
So thank you for sharing your story. I'm adopted as well, and during the pandemic, I also went looking for my biological mother. And I'm wondering, like, what about the pandemic for you spurned, like, this desire to look? For me, I think it was just like the huge scale of loss, seeing so many, or hearing about so many people dying. So I was just curious for you.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's a huge part of it. You know, in the book, I talk about reading this one article in particular that really stuck with me. This was like in April 2020, and there was mention of a man dying alone in a COVID ward, and like the article talked about how he was at that point down to 90 pounds and barely took up any space in the world, and there was no one to contact about the body when he had died. And I think that image was very troubling to me, and so I was sort of engaging with the image, like it was a non-image, right? Because I didn't know what this person looked like, but you know that could be the circumstance for my biological mother, and certainly I'm sure there was some degree of projection also, like, well, that could also be myself, right? But I also think that because in my day-to-day life, you know, I could sort of very much indulge in this notion of like, well, because I had a sort of very robust life, right? You know, and I had all of these points of connection. You can sort of operate in a different way. But one of the things that COVID did was it sort of reified and the privatized dimensions of connection and care in our lives. So, you know, if maybe in general we would be people who might like care about our neighbors or our students or our friends or this or that, right? Like in the first year at least, right, of the pandemic, most people's lives were sort of crunched down to like their nuclear families. And so I think that also sort of drove me to recognize the way in which there was somebody who was not specifically part of that, this mother who didn't raise me.
So funny coming so close. Thank you both. I haven't finished the book. I've started. I haven't finished it yet. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm a memoir hound. Life stories are so endlessly interesting. And this talk of language, did you ever consider imagining your whole life what, imagining your whole life what your mother, I imagine that you wondered, and you've got a private investigator and you flew all the way to Korea. Did you ever consider bringing a translator or bringing a friend that was bilingual so that you would be able to ask what I imagine were endless amounts of questions?
Yeah, I mean, so You know, as it happened, when I did find her, it was sort of like right as Omicron was spiking. And now we kind of don't think much about that, but first of all, Koreans are far more stringent in their hygiene. It's true.
It's true. It's true.
Like
And
around
and
like
around COVID, I
around-
think it was totally crazy there how strict they were.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, one of the things that I ended up not actually detailing to the degree that I might have was, you know, like I ended up having to take, I don't know, like 6 tests while I was there. I wasn't there for very long. But the restrictions were extremely tight at that point. Foreigners were not supposed to be in public at all. There were cards that you needed to get, and you couldn't get one unless you were a citizen. But there was a translator that was used at some point over the phone. But yeah, like over speakerphone.
If nobody else has a question, I actually have a question. So I'm just curious, is the book, has it been translated into Korean?
No, not yet, but who knows?
I was wondering if, you know, your mother knows about the book and if you've ever talked to her about it, or if you've gotten a reaction from her or other family, you know, recently discovered family members.
No, but I mean, we don't really like speak on a regular basis. Yeah. Also, she doesn't really read, so yeah.